Recently, I did a couple of upgrades to my editing PC, so I wanted to make this video to kind of cover the parts that I use and what type of performance you can expect from these parts and from a pretty budget-friendly upgrade like this, especially for those of you that mainly are working with 4K footage. But as you can see here in the intro, it seems to be able to handle at least some 6K footage pretty well. Now, quick little side note, I shoot on the Sony FX30 and the Fujifilm X-T4, both in all-eye H.265 most of the time. But sometimes there's a whole bunch of different footage from different cameras, drones, codecs, what have you on my timeline. So the goal for me was to have a computer that could deal with the 4K footage, and if there's an occasional 6K or 8K file, I'd be alright with, creating proxies for those. But as you can see here in the intro, it seems to be able to handle at least 6K and even 6K RAW pretty well. So far, I'm actually super happy with the overall performance. Just to be clear, before we dive into the kind of meat of the matter, the nitty-gritty, I just want to say that this wasn't a PC built from scratch. I reused a few parts from my old computer that I deemed kind of good enough, and this obviously helped me to keep the overall cost down and put more of my budget towards things that I kind of knew would make a bigger impact performance-wise, if that makes any sense. Anyway, the grand total came out to $804, but I could have gotten away with less and still gotten very, very similar performance if I would have stuck with my initial components or my initial upgrade plan. So I will put links to the things that I actually ordered and some of the things that I was considering before I made some last minute adjustments. So all of those things are going to be linked down below so you can check out the current prices, mix and match your components to fit your budget. Anyway, let's start with the motherboard. So the motherboard that I decided to get was the ASUS ROG Strix B668 Wi-Fi D4. And if you want to be able to upgrade your system further down the road, it's kind of a good idea to pick a motherboard with a few extra expansion ports just to be able to add things on as you go. This motherboard has 4 RAM slots, which actually allowed me to reuse some of my old RAM, which we'll talk more about here in just a second. There's also built-in Wi-Fi 6 and 2 PCI Express ports for graphics cards or GPUs if you want to be able to add a second GPU later on. There's also 3 M.2 SSD slots and a bunch of other things. So essentially plenty of room for you to expand and improve things like storage or get a second GPU and all that fun stuff down the road. Another little neat feature, or more of a bonus maybe, was finally getting a USB 3.2 port, which I know is going to help me save time when I'm doing things like offloading media, doing backups and that kind of stuff. Next up is going to be the CPU, and I was planning on getting the 12th gen i5 12600K, which is about $100 less than the 13th gen i5 13600K that I actually ended up going with last minute. The 13th gen seems to do slightly better when dealing with things like HEVC H.265 files, which is a lot of the files that I'm working with. And by the way, if you're looking at Intel CPUs, I'd highly recommend you to go with their K series because of the built-in graphics supports on those CPUs. Most NLEs will take advantage of this extra little graphics, built-in graphics on the CPU if it's available. I'm using Premiere Pro, which I know is kind of optimized and will utilize that extra capacity when available. Here's some of the results that I got in Cinebench on this new system. I did a run before I upgraded. Sadly, I couldn't find those screenshots, but I think I basically doubled all the scores after the upgrade. So, I'm super happy with that. I also decided to reuse my CPU cooler, the Be Quiet Pure Rock 2, which I've been kind of happy with. It's quiet and it's definitely powerful enough to handle this new CPU. So I just gave it a thorough cleaning. So much power in this little unit. There we go. And some new thermal paste, which obviously saved me a couple of bucks. And same thing with the case, you know, I didn't see a reason to spend money on a new case. I'm not a big fan of RGB lights and having things blinking and lighting up the entire room anyway. And I guess this leads us back to RAM. So in my old PC, I initially had 16 gigs, 2600 megahertz DDR4 that I actually upgraded a few years ago to 32 gigs of Corsair Vengeance 3200 megahertz DDR4 with another upgrade in mind down the road. So with 4 RAM slots in this new computer on this motherboard, I just moved over those RAM circuits and added another 32 of the exact same RAM just to bump everything up to 64 gigs in total. The GPU was also reused. It's the MSI RTX 3050, 8 gigabytes. It's not the flashiest of graphics cards by any means, but I found it to be kind of sufficient enough for the video editing that I do, and I have an old GTX 1650 laying around somewhere that I might drop in later into that second port. It's probably not going to be as efficient and as fast as a dedicated 12 gigabyte card, but once again, a very affordable way to gain some extra performance if and when needed. Now, lastly, we have the PSU or the power supply unit and the M.2 SSD. The PSU or the power supply unit that I ended up going with was the Seasonic Focus GX 750 watts. It's a modular and turns out quiet PSU, but maybe not as quiet as my previous PSUs from Corsair. 650 watts would probably have been enough, but the 750 watt was actually on sale a few dollars cheaper than the 650, so not a tough decision when budget is a factor. The 1TB M.2 SSD was kind of a little extra treat for myself. I've been using an old 120 gig SSD for my operating system, and that one filled up pretty quick. So after I booted up everything and made sure everything was working, I used a software called Acronis to clone my system drive over to that new M2. The rest of the internal storage was also reused from my old computer, a bunch of Samsung Evo SSDs, which I probably gonna replace with 2TB disks someday down the road, but for now they're doing a pretty decent job. The whole rebuild thing took me about 2 hours with all the cleaning and everything. I had to run off and get some new thermal paste, which I forgot to order, so don't forget to order. I'll put a link to that in the description as well. And once again, I couldn't be happier with the performance, which definitely sufficient for my 4K files, and just knowing that I could throw some 6K files or maybe 8K files on the timeline without any big issues. I hope this video was helpful, especially for those of you looking to upgrade, or maybe you're looking at buying a computer for editing and you're kind of wondering how much you should spend or what kind of parts and what level you should be at when you're looking for parts for a build or a new computer. Personally, I don't believe in future-proofing your system too hard, as prices usually come down. And most of the time when you're future-proofing, you're buying excess capacity that you're not going to utilize. And when you finally have need for that extra capacity, the prices of those components have usually come down. So you're going to end up saving a ton of money in the long run if you're just willing to pop out your CPU or GPU or add some more RAM and make that tiny little effort yourself. So that's kind of been my go-to philosophy with keeping the performance relatively high at a relatively low cost. But yeah, that's gonna be it. So I want to thank you for watching. Happy editing, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!